Now, over the weekend, the European Union Election Observer Mission publicly unveiled its 100-page final report on Nigeria's 2019 general elections, capping a 3-month investigation. The report found ample evidence of what it called severe operational and transparency shortcomings, including results collation procedures that were not sufficiently robust, electoral security problems that led to a big rise in deaths, and the abuse of the power of incumbency at both federal and state levels. The report also found that journalists and voters were regularly subjected to harassment and that some independent observers were prevented from doing their work. All of these systemic failings, it said, showed the need for urgent fundamental reforms to the electoral process in Nigeria. Well, in a moment, we'll speak to the deputy head of the EU's Election Observer Mission, Hannah Roberts. But first, here's a short clip from the EU's press conference in Abuja at the weekend when the mission unveiled its final report.
The EU-EOM, therefore, recommend a strengthening of INEC procedures for the collation of results in order to improve integrity and confidence in the process. Second, and also in relation to the result process, we recommend that requirements are established for full results transparency, with data made easily accessible to the public. All results, including those from lower levels, could be displayed at collation centers. In addition, results from all collation centers could be scanned and published on INEC website by the time of the declaration of the final results. Third, we recommend a strengthening of the organizational and operational capacity of INEC. The postponement of the election clearly shows how important it is to improve planning for timely and accountable election preparations. Seven, and finally, a recommendation with regard to media. One of the obstacles to media freedom in Nigeria is the costly and cumbersome licensing requirements for broadcast media, which deter independent broadcasting and encourages coverage that favors the president and incumbent governors. We recommend reform of the licensing system for broadcast media so as to provide for pluralism and diversity in all states. We suggest media ownership structure are publicized. Powers to grant license are vested in the National Broadcasting Commission without presidential approval, and that license fees be tailored to the economic circumstances in each state.
And that's Maria Arena, who's the EU's chief observer, and she was here, of course, during the 2019 elections. Well, for more on the European Union's final report on the 2019 Nigerian elections, I'm joined now in the studio by the deputy chief observer in the EU's Election Observer team, Hannah Roberts. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. I know you had a busy day, so we do appreciate your taking the time to be here with us. Strong words from your team in this final report, stronger perhaps than in the 2015 election reports that you issued then?
I think every election is different, so we don't like to compare. And 2015 was obviously a very special election to have a peaceful transfer of power, the acceptance of results, and it was something that we all looked for to see if there was going to be a further pattern of strengthening the democratic and electoral process in Nigeria. But the way that we fundamentally look at an election is to look to see if an election meets the international commitments that a country has signed up to. So we're essentially looking to see if citizens' rights have been upheld in the electoral process. So the rights that are contained in the national legislation, but then in the international right, or the rights contained in international treaties and political commitments that a country has made. So we come in with fresh eyes to each election rather than just comparing to the previous one. But I have to say that in 2015, and I was lucky enough to be here then as well, in addition to noting the political success of those elections, we also noted that there were systemic problems And unfortunately, we see that this time round there have been some improvements in some areas, certainly, but also some of those systemic problems are recurring. And that's why for us it's very important that the country now looks at what are the ways forward, how to improve elections in the future so there's not a recurring pattern of problems that become entrenched in Nigerian elections.
And before we get to that look at the future, just summarize for us your final report on that 2019 election. What were your findings? Brief, summarize it. Well,
I could talk for a long time, as you said.
Yeah,
it's a 100-page report, but I'll try and be brief.
Yeah.
Essentially, we were concerned that the way this election is characterised is by one, as you say, with operational and transparency problems, with electoral security problems, and with a low voter turnout. And of course, a low voter turnout can be for many reasons, but we always want more people going to the polls, more people participating. So those things are matters that, as I say, are something one hope would improve in future elections. We did also note a number of improvements in this election and a number of strengths in the electoral process. So some of these include the introduction of continuous voting, also the change in the constitution that allowed for younger people to run as candidates, and importantly the role that civil society played. They, we feel, are very important in the electoral reform process before the election, but also in providing electoral information. They were out there on the ground seeing what was happening right across the country, and in bringing accountability into the process by holding not just the election administration but others to account. So there were those positives too, but as you mentioned in your introduction, there's also a number of things that are problems that we think can be avoided in the future, and those problems are not the way anybody wants an election to be.
And based on your findings in that final report, what are your recommendations to the Electoral Commission, the government and the political parties?
And it's exactly that. We've made 30 recommendations, and these are for a range of people. They're not just for the election administration. To have a good election takes more than just the election administration. It takes the attitude of parties, the behaviour of parties. It requires a good legal framework, which again comes back to the Parliament and the parties. Also the way the security forces behave, civil society, etc. So our recommendations are multifaceted. They relate to a number of different agencies, and we think all of them have to be involved to really sort of bring this process on for future elections. So if you look at the report, you'll see in the back there's a table which lists all of the 30 recommendations and says which is the primary institution responsible. I have to say, looking through them, the majority of them involve legal change. So therefore, we really look to the parties in Parliament to see what they're going to do next. To really make a substantial, profound difference to Nigerian elections, there needs to be a process of legal reform. And what we've seen is that around the world is that legal reform doesn't happen overnight. So one can't do it at the last moment. It's something that takes time to discuss, to debate, to get agreement, consensus on issues, and then to work out the legislative detail, and then of course to put that into practice. So it's something that needs to happen quickly. So as I say, there's 30 recommendations looking at all different aspects, but there's an onus particularly on the parties through Parliament, and also, of course, on the election administration, what it can do administratively within its own institution.
Right, but when you talk about legal reforms and you sort of emphasize that, what exactly are you, just tell us a bit more about the recommendation that you made there. What sort of legal reform are we talking about?
So most of our recommendations involve some sort of legal reform.
Right.
Some of them it has to be a legal reform, and some it's more discretionary. It would be stronger if it was secured in law. So for example, if there were stronger requirements in the law for the Election Commission to have more robust procedures around the collation and to publish the results of polling units, not just at the polling unit itself, but also centrally to make the data available so that people can easily cross-check. That means it's much more likely to happen, of course, if it's a legal requirement. So there are many recommendations like that that would just be much stronger in the law. Some are quite profound also, for example, the system of primaries, having, again, more requirements, so there's more regulation of it to reduce the contention that there is around the primaries. And we all know how that played out in the election process with the disputes that arose from it, that then meant that there was an abundance of legal cases. which then made it harder for the election administration to plan and for voters to know what they were voting for. So you'll also see that another of our recommendations, which involves legal change, is to strengthen the system of dispute resolution, particularly the pre-election day dispute resolution, by having tribunals, which are now currently available for the post-election day cases, but for those tribunals to also work before election day, so that there is one place where people go to for a petition rather than the current situation of multiple courts and tribunals, and there is a decision and adjudication before election day, so then when voters go to the polls, they know what they're voting for.
And just, you mentioned in your, I think it was the executive summary, that you detected the abuse of the power of incumbency at both federal and state levels. What did you find?
So this was a recurring theme in a number of the different aspects of the election that we looked at. And again, as you say, we saw this problem at both federal and state level. So it means it affected both parties being involved in this in some way or another.
Some of the other parties have governorship, they control states, basically. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's why we say it's a systemic problem and it needs to be addressed systemically to stop this. The clearest example was around state media, but there were also other examples, for example, offices being used for campaigning purposes or state office websites being used for campaigning. But in terms of the media, we've got a very comprehensive section on the media, as we had a media monitoring team that measured outlets minute by minute, second by second, to look at the coverage that the different sides were getting. And when we looked at the federal level outlets, the federal level radio performed much better. But the national television, the state television, NTA, clearly had an incumbency bias, as we saw in all of the 9 state radios that we monitored, to the extent that 72 to 100% of the coverage during primetime news and primetime television, primetime radio, was for the incumbent, and 8 of the 9 barely mention the name of the opposition during the news programs, if at all.
Okay, well, just stay with us because we want to hear a little bit more of what you have to say. You're watching the Arise interview, plenty more still to come, including we continue our discussion on the EU's final report on the 2019 general election. Stay with us. And as you've been hearing, the European Union's Election Observer Mission has publicly released its final report on Nigeria's 2019 general election. It says that the ballot, which was won by the incumbent, President Buhari, was not transparent and was marred by violence, intimidation, and voter harassment. Strong statements, especially when compared to what the mission said about the 2015 presidential election. Here's a bit more from the EU's press conference in Abuja at the weekend when the mission unveiled its final report.
The 19th election became increasingly marred by violence, fatalities, and intimidation of voters and INEC officials, mainly by party supporters. INEC reported attacks on its staff and officers and stated that some soldiers and armed gangs invaded collation centers in rivers during the state elections. During the 20 March supplementary election, extensive electoral security problems were observed by our mission in some areas, with groups of men with weapons intimidating and obstructing the process, and security agencies ineffective at protecting citizens' rights to vote. The Interagency Consultative Committee on Election Security, chaired by INEC, included all of the responsibility security agency. It was not sufficiently effective. It didn't involve stakeholders, nor did it provide necessary information. We recommend that in the future it works more transparently and inclusively by holding regular consultation with political parties and civil society. We suggest also that security arrangements, as well as rules of engagement, updates and complaints mechanism are all made public for more transparency. There needs to be a clear delineation of the operational role of different security agencies, with the military only involved in electoral security at the request of INEC. Our fifth priority recommendation concerns electoral dispute resolution mechanism. These were used extensively during the electoral process, but there were overlapping jurisdictions and conflicting and late rulings. All of these created uncertainty in the electoral process. Therefore, to promote access to remedy and to avoid petitions being taken to different courts at the same time, we suggest that electoral tribunals are extended to cover pre-election cases. We also recommend more judges are appointed to increase judicial capacity.
And that's, of course, a clip there from the EU's press conference held in Abuja on Saturday, where the EU's Election Observer Mission unveiled its final report on the Nigerian elections. That was Maria Arena, who's the EU's chief observer. And with me in the studio is the deputy head of the EU's Election Observer Mission, Hannah Roberts. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. Of course, she talked quite a bit about security there, and clearly there was something for the security services, because obviously they're a key part of the electoral process.
Absolutely, security is fundamental, and of course it's a very difficult task to provide security to make sure that candidates can campaign, voters can go to campaign events, receive information and go safely to the polls. It's no easy responsibility. But for us, as the chief observer was saying, we felt that the mechanism for coordinating the security arrangements needs to be stronger in the future to be more effective. In particular, that there's more transparency around the way that it's operating and which agency has responsibility for what, and what the rules of engagement are for those different respective agencies. And also that there's consultation with the parties, with civil society, so people know how things are going to work and have a chance to express their views on what will be the best way of doing this very formidable task. As we've noted in our report, regrettably, it appears that somewhere in the realm of 150 people have died during this election process. I should stress that this figure is based on information that came to our long-term observers in the field. We had 40 working in teams of 2 around the country, and also from cross-referencing media reports. So it may well be that the figure is higher, or it's not 100% reliable, but that's the broad picture that we have. And of course, that's 150 people too many. And of course, we know the concerns and the allegations there are about whether the security forces behaved in selective ways at times. And to avoid this in the future, we think it's critical that these issues are addressed early, and as I say, in a consultative, coordinated way. And the great thing that Nigeria has is the off-cycle elections, which give an opportunity to develop new practices and to test them out, so that when the next general elections come, there's more experience of having done things in hopefully an improved way.
Obviously you have no powers of enforcement.
No.
And it is one thing to submit findings and final reports, quite another for whatever recommendations you make to be implemented. I mean, what assurances have you received in that regard?
So as you rightly said, it's of course not our job to enforce. Our job that we've been invited here to do is to come and observe, to assess the election process and to make recommendations for the future. That's what we've done with our final report and during the time that we were here. It's now, of course, up to Nigerians to look at what happens next. How do people and institutions want to go forward with this? As I was saying earlier, what's critical is to start this early, because it takes time to make changes to an election process, and to involve as many different stakeholders as possible, not just the political elite, not just the parties, but also the media, civil society, and to have as an inclusive a process as possible. We, of course, have been very pleased to hear some of the responses when people have verbally told us, and in writing even said, that they support the report and support the implementation of the recommendations that we have. And that's fantastic. But what really matters are actions. It needs more than words, it needs concrete actions. And as I was just saying, Nigeria has this opportunity through the off-cycle elections to really develop things in a tried and tested way before the 2023 general elections.
And it's got to be concerted action. So it's not just the federal government, although the onus, rather sort of heavily lies on them because they've got the powers. But you've also got the political parties and the way they, as you said, regulate their operations and so on. Now, the EU, and by extension, its election observer group, have been part of the progress of democracy, if I can call it that, in Nigeria. Since I suppose 1999.
The EU has been invited to every general election since 1999 to come and send an observation mission, and has done so.
And do you find the same problems recurring over and over again?
Personally, I think this is one of the exciting things about Nigeria, that there's clearly a change between elections. There's been development. And the most pronounced example is 2007, when there was clearly a very problematic election, a highly critical EU observer report, as there were from other organisations too. And then a quite profound change happened after that election. What we've seen since then are, of course, some improvements, but also that there remain, or various systemic problems remain.
That haven't changed, basically.
Exactly, and that's why we feel those need to be addressed, and addressed in a fundamental way.
Right, so not to interrupt you, so there are recommendations that you've made in the past from the outset in 1999, perhaps, which you're still making today in 2019, are there not?
I must confess I haven't checked the 1999 report.
Well,
for the recommendations.
From 1999,
but for example, a number of the recommendations
Right.
that we make now, we also made in 2015. Of course, they're often slightly different because circumstances have changed somewhat. But again, what we saw between these two elections was that there was ultimately a late process of looking at legal
Right.
reform.
So you would say that the level of implementation of your recommendations has been quite low since perhaps the last election or the one before that?
So when we reviewed the implementation of the 30 recommendations that we made in 2015, we like the number 30, we noted that only 4 had been implemented. And we think this was this could have been higher. And the legal reform that was going through the Parliament could have helped this. But again, now is the opportunity, now is the time not to wait until the next time.
Right, and sorry, go on.
I should also stress that while our job as the observation mission is over, we're offering to the best of our abilities, our analysis, our recommendations. The EU, of course, remains in Nigeria and remains ready to stand with Nigeria with any support it may want in terms of looking at how to implement these recommendations and to undertake reform more widely.
Now, you talked about the best of your abilities. Do you also make recommendations about how to improve your election monitoring here?
That's a good question. Of course, in the same way that no election is perfect, election observation missions can also always improve. And of course, it's a tough environment given the size of Nigeria and the size of the population as well. So of course, there's room for improvements. We're still working that through. Now that we're at the end, it's the time for us to reflect and to think back about how we might do things differently.
And what's the most urgent issue? I know you've touched on a whole host of things, but the most urgent issue that you think needs to be addressed in the conduct of Nigerian elections to ensure that they are freer and fairer going forward?
It's very hard for us to identify one, but what we have done is identify 7 recommendations out of our 30, which we think are the most fundamental, the most important for reform. So these include having stronger, more robust procedures for the collation of results, having more transparency in the results process, improving INEC's organisational and operational capacities, improving the security arrangements, as I was just talking about, so there's a stronger mechanism for that, extending the licensing system for private media so that there can be greater diversity. And as I mentioned earlier, having tribunals be extended to cover the pre-election day period, so you don't have a multitude of legal cases up to and over election day, and also legal measures to require parties to have more
Right.
female candidates.
Okay.
Because of course it's highly regrettable that Nigeria, such a leading country in the continent, has the lowest rate of
Right.
women in parliament, and that it's
Okay.
declined again.
I know you've got to go, so I'll let you go. Hannah Roberts, who's the EU's deputy head of the Observer Mission here, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Charles.
You're watching the Arise interview, plenty more still ahead, including, despite election promises, Nigeria's unemployment rate has almost tripled. We'll hear more about what's gone wrong. Stay with us.